Hello everyone, this is Cole and Jung Ho. Welcome to our 20-time PC building guide. What you see on screen right now are all the parts we'll be using, so if you're planning on building a PC, we hope you'll find this guide useful. Alright, so we'll be starting with the case, and what you need to do first is grab a Phillips head screwdriver and take off the side panels. So the big screws you see up in the top and bottom of the case, you'll need to be taking off. So just grab a Phillips head screwdriver and so just take. Now these are thumb screws, so at some point they're pretty easy to take off with just your thumbs, as you can see in the footage right now. So once you get the top one screwed off, just take off the bottom one, and then just pry off the side panel. Now some cases do this differently, but on this one you just need to pull back, and it should release just fine. Now just go to the other side panel, in this case the back one, and the similar process, just take a Phillips head screwdriver and just screw it to the left. And then in that scenario, it should just come out pretty easily, especially since it's a thumb screw. So it shouldn't be too hard to get out. And then once you're done with this screw, you need to just come to the bottom one. And just like all the other screws, it should come out pretty easily once you're done unscrewing it. And just like before, you need to pull out the side panel. Of course, every case does this differently, but in our case, you need to just pull it back. And then grab the box of extra little goodies that has things like zip ties, extra screws.
So moving on to the motherboard, open it and then look for any handles on the cardboard, and just as a side note, do not fumble it around as you'll see me do. Grab the white handles and the plastic piece at the back, gently place it aside, then close the box. Then place the motherboard back on. Look for an opening in the anti-static plastic bag. And then make sure to hold the black plastic piece while trying to slide the bag off. And then take the cardboard out, and now to move on to the RAM stick. Now moving on to the RAM sticks, you want to look for 4 long sockets on the motherboard. Pull back one of the clips and place the RAM stick in the middle, or make sure the groove in the RAM stick matches along with the notch. And make sure to evenly press firmly so that it doesn't tilt towards one side. And as you can see in the video, I'm kind of paranoid because I don't want to break it, but don't worry about it because it won't break just from adding pressure. Just keep pressing until you hear the clicking noise, and that's a sign you installed it correctly. Moving on to the second RAM stick, pull back the clip and push the stick in evenly on both sides to make sure one side is tilted up. Apply firm and gentle pressure until the clip pulls back in.
Moving on to the CPU, you're going to look for a gray square-shaped socket in the middle of the motherboard. You're going to look for the metal arm that's on either the left or right side, and you're going to push down and pull it back, so that way it opens up the pin slots for the CPU. Now when you get to the packaging of the CPU, you need to be careful and open it with firm but gentle pressure, because in AMD CPUs, like we have here, they have pins on the underside which can bend, and if any of them bend, then the CPU is next to useless. So, when you're opening the packaging, of course, just be careful when opening it. And once it's open, you're going to look for a gold corner. In this case, ours is on the bottom left, and you're going to align that with an arrow-shaped icon on the CPU socket. And once you found both of them, you're going to take the corner and then align it with the arrow. And then you're going to drop it into its socket with no force needed because that can bend the pins. You're going to take the arm on the side and then push it down, giving it a firm, tight. Now, before we actually install the motherboard, we need to install the I/O shield, which is designed to protect your ports on the back. Now, this comes with your motherboard in its box, so you need to take this and apply it to the back of the case. There is a designated slot for it, as you see here. Now, this is very frustrating. This can be very frustrating to put in, so don't be afraid to use a lot of force. But again, apply it firmly and evenly, so that way it becomes less of a frustration. And once that's done, we're going to move on to the CPU cooler. So now, some motherboards may do this differently, but in our case, there was a guard protecting both sets of screw holes. So you're going to simply unscrew those and take out the black plastic piece like you're seeing here. then once that's done, you're going to take out the screws, and then you're going to... Alright, moving on to the cooler, you're going to take it out of its packaging very carefully by grabbing it by the top. You're going to make sure that the thermal paste on the bottom of the cooler is touching the top of the CPU, and that the screws line up with the screw holes that we freed up earlier. Once that's done, you're going to take a screwdriver and begin screwing them in. Alright, so one thing to keep note of is don't screw in these too deep, because if you screw in one too deep, you can give one screw that's diagonally across too much elevation, which makes it very hard to screw in. We ran into that actually. And another good rule of thumb is to go diagonally across from the the screw you're doing currently. So in that example, we did the bottom right one, so we moved on to the top left one. And now we hope you pay attention to that dangling thing you saw. That is the power connector. So I think you can see right now it's a CPU fan on the bottom right. The CPU fan needs to be plugged into the motherboard, which is in turn plugged in by the power supply to give the CPU fan power and to keep it properly cooled. So just look for a connector right above the CPU and you should be fine. Alright, once all that's done, it's time to put the motherboard into the case. Now before you put the motherboard into the case, you need to make note of things called standoffs, which are in the back of the case, which if you look at the I/O shield actually in back right there towards the bottom left, you can actually see one just right below the I/O shield. Now in case your case does not have these pre-installed, you just need to look at the case manual and the box of goodies that you pulled out earlier in order to find the extra standoffs you need in order to properly screw in the motherboard. Otherwise, if you don't have any standoffs installed in the case, then the motherboard cannot be properly aligned with the I/O shield, and that could cause a lot of problems and headaches. So just make sure you have all the standoffs properly installed, and then once that's done, you just need to properly align the screw holes with the standoffs in order to make sure that it forms a good structurally sound seal to make sure your motherboard does not go anywhere. And once that's done, it's time to install the graphics card. Now, to start, we need to take off this vertical black panel on the back of the case, and you can just use a regular Phillips head screwdriver to unscrew these, and then you just need to pull it off. And then for our graphics card, we need to take off 2 of these back panel protectors. Most need 2, especially higher end ones, but some only need 1. I don't think any need 3, but once you get these off, you should be good to go.
Now onto the graphics card. Just take it out of, open the box carefully. In our case, we found about 2 to 3 layers of styrofoam and other products. We don't really need those for now. Just take them out, put them aside. Here you'll see the graphics card wrapped in anti-static plastic. Gently grab it by the sides and look for an opening. There should be tape on it telling you where the opening is, just to make it easier. And afterwards take it out. Alright, now look for the long, thin PCIe socket. Pull the clip back and then get the graphics card. There should be a connector aligning with a notch. Just press down gently yet firmly so it doesn't break anything. And once you hear a clicking sound, that's when you know it's in completely.
Alright, moving on to the SSD, just look for a specially designed cage like we have here. Now most cases do this differently, but on our case, the NZXT S340, there's a special cage that goes on top of the power supply mount on bottom. So in our case, we just need to look for the grooves that this cage aligns into, and then once we get the grooves aligned, we just slot it in so that the screw hole aligns properly. And then we want to also make sure that the connectors are also facing backward in this case, at least, because that is where we'll be plugging in the SATA cables and the power supply cable for when we install the wiring. So just get it screwed into its cage and it should be good to go. Moving on to the hard drive, there should be a designated cage somewhere in the case. In our case, it was towards the bottom left where the power supply will be mounted, like we showed you earlier. Now, when you're mounting the hard drive, make sure all the connectors that you see are facing towards you, outward, so that way you can plug in the SATA cables and the power cable to go into the power supply on the motherboard. Now it's time to install the power supply. Just like the side panels before, this cage right here is taken off with thumb screws that you can start with a Phillips head screwdriver and then move on to your thumbs once you're comfortable with it, so they should not come out with much hassle. So just like the side panels, just unscrew them one by one and you should be good to go. Alright, this next step of the process can be quite a headache because this task is something that requires essentially 3 hands to do. We need to take the cage that we just screwed off and screw it onto the back of the power supply. So we need to just look for the cutouts in the cage and line them up with the screw holes in the back of the power supply. And as you can see here, they are very annoying to get in because if either the cage or the screws get misaligned, they're very hard to actually keep in place. But once you get in one screw, it shouldn't be too hard to move on to the next one. As you see here, it does require 3 hands to do. That's actually my hand holding it in place while Jungho is screwing it in. Like we said, it's just very annoying to do because the cage itself can be misaligned very easily and it's very hard to keep in place with just only 2 hands. So once you get typically 1 or 2 screws in, it's not very hard to keep the cage in place while you're screwing it in. Alright, so as you're putting in the power supply, make note of the fan on the power supply itself and the vent on the case, and you need to align those two up so that way the power supply can get proper ventilation. Now, just as we were installing the cage, this can also be a very annoying process because this is a task that essentially requires 3 hands to do once again because you need to align the screw holes on the cage with the screw holes on the case. And it's very hard to keep the cage steady because the power supply weighs it down. As you can see back there, this is a very annoying process. This will probably take quite a long time to do if you only have 2 hands because it's very hard to keep steady, but if you have someone else to help you like we did here, it's not going to be that bad. Just keep that in mind. Once you're installing this power supply, it can be very hard to keep the screw holes aligned, but it should not be too much of a hassle once you've actually found the screw hole and started screwing it in. And a good rule of thumb is also to go across from the screw you just did to make sure that nothing gets misaligned. Now, I hate to say this, but we actually could not get a lot of footage for wiring due to time constraints, so our deep apologies for that. But all the wiring should be in the manual, so that shouldn't be too much of an issue for you, as long as you read the instructions very carefully. But thankfully, we were able to get all the wires together, and that is Jungho turning on the case and the power supply, and that is the finished product that we put together. So, we'll be doing some quick panorama shots of all the parts in the case wired together. But like I said, wiring, even though we couldn't show that, all the wiring documentation should be in each of the manuals, so it should not be very hard to read because most of them are clearly labeled, so it's not that difficult of a process. So here's the final product we put together. This was $1,500 in total, and this was also Jungho's very first PC putting together, or this is his first PC that he put together. So thank you all for tuning in. This is a very fun project to do, and we hope to see you next time.